Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey, gang, I'm going to open this up with just a quick word or two about Memorial Day. If you're around the round world or you're specifically in the United States, I'm sharing these stories with you. This is a best of, so you might have heard some of these before. But I hope that in the midst of all the fun and frivolity you might be having with your friends, families, and loved ones, please take at least a moment to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. That's what today is about. I kind of am extending that to two family members of mine who served in Vietnam and who have both passed away, not during service, but afterwards. I don't want to get into the politics and the back and forth, but hey, this is my channel and I'm going to do that.
During World War II, I had the misfortune of being on a freighter that was temporarily stranded in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Our engine broke down about 7 days out of port, and even though we were part of a convoy headed for Italy, the demands for materials made by the war forced the rest of the ships to leave us behind, while they went on ahead. From 1942 to 1943, the waters of the Atlantic were thick with Nazi submarines, and they all had commanders eager to sink ships that might be helping the Allied forces. We were all tense and nervous, expecting to see 2 or 3 of those terrible metal fish streaking towards our helpless vessel at any time. By the 3rd day of bobbing in the water like a sitting duck during hunting season, the crew had become really jumpy and tense. We had a few guns on deck, but we all knew that they would be of little use against a submarine unless they surfaced. And it was hardly likely that a commander would waste the time and effort to surface in order to engage us in an old-fashioned sea battle. Launching a couple of torpedoes at our ship from the safety of Neptune's domain would better do the trick. In late afternoon of the 3rd day, I was on my bunk, trying to get some rest before my next watch. I was completely alone in the quarters, and I was awakened by the sensation of a warm hand nudging my shoulder. I grunted and tried to shrug off the annoyance that was interfering with my sleep, but something seemed very familiar about this nudging. I opened my eyes and saw the image of my mother standing next to my bunk. She was still pushing at my shoulder, and when my eyes widened in astonishment at her presence, she smiled at me. "Vic, honey," she told me in her usual soft, pleasant voice, "you'd better get up now. It's time to get up." Before I could respond in any manner whatsoever, the form of my mother disappeared. My mother had been dead for 8 years, and for a minute or so I thought that maybe I'd been dreaming, perhaps reliving a day in my childhood when my mother had woken me up so that I could get ready to go to school. But the more I thought about the apparition, the more I began to feel so damn uneasy that I started to get dressed and got out of my bunk room as quickly as I could. Since I didn't wish to be alone after that strange experience, and I still had a couple of hours before I was due to report to my watch, I decided to go down to the engine room and talk with the engineers who were working on the repairs. I had no more than nodded hello at one of the firemen, who was a good buddy of mine, when a tremendous explosion shook the entire freighter and knocked us all off kilter. I went down on one knee, and a couple of the men fell flat on their backsides. No one had to tell us that we had just been hit by one of the Germans' torpedoes. Within a matter of minutes, all of the crew members had crowded into lifeboats and were rowing away from the sinking ship. Fortunately, there were no casualties, but as I looked back at the slowly sinking freighter, I clearly saw that there could have been a fatality if the ghost of my mother had not awakened me when she did. From my position on the lifeboat, I could see that a massive hole had been blasted in the starboard side of the ship. I had been sleeping directly above the spot of impact only moments before the torpedo had struck. My mother had somehow managed to go on recess from heaven so that she would be able to wake me up just in time. In October 1965, the Air Force airfield at Tan Son Nhut had enough to keep it busy with Viet Cong raids and airstrikes without having to worry about restless spirits. But a pesky phantom Frenchman had this nasty habit of setting off flares and keeping all of us on edge. I was an air policeman, and I was making my customary watch one night. I was out near the bomb and ammunition dump when someone triggered off one of the flares. The captain in charge of our detail immediately began to fire in the direction of that flare, thinking that he saw someone in black pajamas drop into a ditch. But when our men got there, the ditch was empty. The next thing we knew, another flare went off, and there seemed to be someone up in a tree just beyond the old French tower. Our captain again opened up, and so did the rest of our guys, but not one person fell from the tree. We all glanced uneasily at each other on the moonlit flooded runway. What had caused those flares to go off? The adrenaline was flowing in our veins, and our nerves could not be quieted. Some veteran Vietnamese guards explained to us that the ghost was that of a French captain who was on duty in the tower when his outpost was overrun by Viet Minh on the last day of the war waged against the French in 1954. The Frenchman had put up a fierce, though vain, struggle. When he was finally captured, the communists decided to repay him for the trouble he had caused them by beheading him. The French captain had pled with his captors to be shot like a soldier instead of beheaded like a criminal, but the communists had made up their minds. He was clad in black pajamas and then decapitated. The Vietnamese soldiers that we worked with believed that the Frenchman's body was buried in an old Buddhist cemetery out by the airport gates, but his head was hidden somewhere near the old watchtower. The story went that the Frenchman, now a member of the Unquiet Dead, would make regular forays to the old tower in search of his head if he was ever to find any rest. This was only the first time of many spectral visits from this phantom Frenchman that I experienced. Our soldiers became accustomed to the visits, and they learned to disregard the pajama-clad figure hovering around the old French tower at the edge of the main runway. Flares continued to be set off mysteriously, however. The Vietnamese soldiers were firm in their beliefs regarding this nocturnal specter. They always avoided night watch on the edge of the runway, and they repeatedly refused to allow the old tower to be torn down. When the runways were extended to accommodate fighter jets, all the other towers were removed, but not the one where the Frenchman continued to seek for his head. Back in the early 60s, my father, who was a Philippine Air Force officer, was posted in Saigon as a military attaché, so we lived in then South Vietnam for 3 to 4 years during the early part of the Vietnam War. For reasons unknown to me, we moved houses 3 times, and the second house we lived in was huge and very old, more like a mini mansion, obviously French architecture. We actually rented just the bottom part of the house while the owner, an ethnic Chinese Vietnamese widow and her 2 daughters, lived upstairs. I remembered my sis and I used to go upstairs for tutoring by one of her daughters about basic French as we attended a French school called Colette, and later on another school called Jardin des Enfants, which is on the same street as the Philippine Embassy. We also attended American school our last year in Vietnam. The house was situated beside a cemetery, and what seemed to me that was so odd even at that time, there was a gate near the back part of the yard which opened to the cemetery. The layout of our house looked strange, too. There was this huge lounge room, big enough for a dance floor space, and a short hallway to my parents' bedroom and bathroom. And then there was this other large dining entertainment area in between, which separated our parents' bedroom and our bedrooms in the kitchen. My brother had his own bedroom, and me and my 2 sisters, at that time we were 7, 8, and 10, all slept in one king-size bed together. Our bedroom didn't have a door, but my brother's room had one, and we could see his door from our bedroom. From what I can recall as a 7-year-old, I was wakened by our bedroom window shuddering as it was a stormy night, and the wind was howling through the entire window. It was quite spooky, and I couldn't go back to sleep. Somehow I felt something was going to happen. And it did. I saw a headless figure of what appeared to be in a long black coat floating from our bedroom to my brother's room, and then it disappeared. I saw part of a skeleton appear, which looked luminous, peering through the crack of the door hinge of my brother's bedroom door. And his bedroom door was always left slightly ajar, and I just sat there paralyzed while I was witnessing these apparitions. I tried to wake up my sisters to tell them what I had just seen, but they were out, and they didn't seem interested. I couldn't go back to sleep as I was too scared that the ghosts might come near me. The following morning, I told the family what I had seen during the night, and to my relief, they believed me. My sisters also said that they were aware that I was trying to wake them up to tell them what I had seen, but they were too scared, so they pretended they were asleep. From that date on, I assure you, I believe in ghosts and spirits. I was posted in Fob Anaconda during my deployment in Iraq. I was one of 24 soldiers who manned one of 4 entrances into our base. We covered the north entrance, where locals would enter and go through our security scanner. They'd be checked for illegal substances and be routinely verified by our canine division. We came across 80 locals who worked in our base on a daily basis, half of who presented goods in our flea markets for sale at the bazaar, and the other half who worked for our construction yard doing manual labor and earning American dollars, since Iraq's economy was ran by our dollar currency. During my deployment, I had grown fond of many of the Iraq locals and began to grow interest in their culture and respected them as equals because, hey, I'm not closed-minded or racist. During the end of my tour, I noticed that many of the workers had perished because Al-Qaeda spies would denounce their family and then murder them while they had exited our base for aiding us and taking American money as a form of payment. We had a strict procedure of allowing locals inside the base. Each person was assigned a military ID card which had their picture, date of birth, and microchip attached to the card. After they were scanned into our system, they had to go through an X-ray machine to see if they were smuggling any items inside the base. During my last 2 weeks, something insane happened that was recorded on our reports that raised the eyebrows across our company. It was the ghost story of the year. One of the older locals that I generally talked to on a daily basis came in through the X-ray machine, but was acting very odd and looked pale. His name was Hazim, and for the first time in months, he didn't speak to me or acknowledge me. He just looked sad and uncomfortable, so I left him alone. I assumed it was a death in the family or something terrible that had happened to him. So again, I left him alone, and as he turned in his badge to enter the base, we did a recount on the badge IDs to make sure all of the locals were accounted for, and that the badges matched the correct number of people. By the end of the day, the same crowd shuffled through the X-ray machines and picked up their IDs and made their way back home to their own villages. I noticed that Hazim's badge was still hanging on our wall, and he was still active in our base according to our system. I quickly called construction yard, alerting them that we had a local that may have been left behind in the latrines or possibly had wandered off into the working area. They double-checked their cameras and said that all of the individuals signed in had been signed out and that their records were spot on. Our platoon sergeant was worried that we might have allowed him inside the confines of the base without checking him through the system, and we did a thorough manhunt for him. But nothing came up. The base was put on alert, and the interpreters were notified of the situation, asking for every individual they could to help locate Hazim. That morning we checked in all the normal locals who were working and noticed that Hazim did not return. So we marked him MIA in our records, and later that afternoon, his wife and son came up to our control point with a cart. She was explaining to the interpreter what had happened, and the interpreter was pale and sweating as if he had seen a ghost. He reluctantly turned to me and attempted to collect himself. Hazim had been killed the day before by an insurgent because he was working for the U.S. He was shot to death around 7 a.m., and during that time frame, his family was held hostage as they were being questioned by the terrorists as to who else he had been working with and who else had been working with him. Hazim had been wrapped up inside the cart, his body cleaned, and was ready to be buried, and we had the mortuary affairs come to identify the body. Still crying and mourning, his wife handed me his badge that was stained with his blood. I just said, "This is impossible," as I knew we had already had that badge inside the office. I was confused, but to prove myself that a duplicate must have been made, I ran inside, but to my astonishment, there was no badge on the wall. I checked the computers. There was also no log of him entering the base on file, and I was extremely pissed and thought that someone was playing a joke on me. I told the interpreter that we all saw him enter the base and that he gave us his ID, and he replied that it wasn't possible since he had been dead since the morning of that day. Puzzled and confused, I demanded to check the video recordings of the previous day to counter-argue that we were right. The video recording captured Hazim entering the building and scanning through the X-ray captured on video, and as he got off the X-ray machine, he vanished as he started to remove his badge. We watched it over and over again in disbelief, because that is physical evidence that he was there and everyone saw him. His wife watched the video and continued to cry as she acknowledged his appearance in the video. Our company commander had us destroy the video as it was in bad taste, and anything like that leaking out onto YouTube would face UCMJ charges for uploading confidential footage. Hazim was buried the same day with all of his relatives at his village. One of his coworkers came up to me and explained that Hazim had been secretly putting aside money and was hiding it somewhere in the base and had kept it away from the Taliban, preventing them from robbing him, and he had instructed his friend to give the funds to his family upon the possibility of his death. His coworker explained to me, even at his death, his loyalty to his family was bound by his soul and his love to ensure that they were taken care of. In a span of just 1 year, Hazim had saved $8,000, which was more than enough for his family to live off for the next 10 years.
Haunted Places by Sleepy Lee GM. I was stationed at the old Station Sandy Hook building before it got torn down and rebuilt. They used to have berthing on the second deck, and because it was a piece of shit and had asbestos up the wazoo, most folks avoided it. I slept there a couple of times, and that fucking hallway was creepy as fucking shit. I can't say for sure since it was around something like 2 a.m., but one night I rounded the corner once heading towards my room, and the light at the very end of the hall by the second stairway went out, and I swear I saw the silhouette of someone just standing there, just like in the movies, the middle of the hallway. I noped the fuck out of there and slept in my fucking car that night. The rooms were dorm style, so it would be a double with a shared head between 2 rooms. Essentially 4 persons per head. And like I said before, most people avoided that fucking place. I've stayed there numerous times as the only person on the floor, and have heard furniture shifting and moving around in the middle of the night in both other rooms and the room adjacent to mine. I could hear water faucets turning on and off and shit like toilets flushing, everything. Even though I was there so much, I really hated sleeping there. The old GM shop there in the Casemates, World War II area concrete bunkers, was haunted as hell as well. That's where the old gun vault used to be, and the way it was designed, it was within a small compound surrounded by elevated concrete. I was once doing the round and felt like I was being watched, and I looked up and across the field, above the old range, and there was some fucking guy watching me. I mean, it was almost impossible for that to happen when the casemates were built. I mean, the Army planted dense growth to make it difficult to traverse through. And not to mention, that dude would have needed to scale concrete walls like 15 feet high. The Army had also planted poison ivy and poison sumac within the dense growth to further prevent and discourage climbers. Well, I shut the vault door ASAP and yelled out to the guy asking what the hell he was doing. Well, the guy just casually stood up and walked away. Through the trees, the poison ivy and poison sumac and everything. And the strangest thing was I heard nothing. I didn't see the vegetation being disturbed either. Because the casemates blocked reception, I had no cell service, and I ended up sprinting out and around trying to get a visual of this guy, while frantically calling the GM1 and OOD, EOD, but there was nothing we could really do since we couldn't scale those fucking walls to check. I had those guys stay there while I completed the round, and hoped I would not have to pull that shift again before I left. What Was That? By Love to Art. I was at basic training at Fort Jackson in 2009, and we were in the woods doing our 7-day FTX. We were doing guard one night, and there were rumors that the drill sergeants were going to attack us that night. I was at a checkpoint with 2 other guys, and it was just a dark dirt trail in the middle of the woods, with thick brush on both sides of the trail and just a few feet away from the tree line in either direction. I can't remember if our shift was 1 or 2 hours, but it was around 2 a.m. and close to the end of the shift. Despite it being so late, all 3 of us were on and super alert because we were a bunch of high-speed dorks and we weren't going to get shown up by the DSs. So finally we saw, about a quarter of a mile away, a flashlight coming up the trail. It was bouncing up and down just like someone holding a flashlight and walking at a medium pace. We all saw it and immediately got into position and waited, watching it come up the trail. All 3 of us stared at the light coming closer and closer and closer for probably about 5 minutes straight, and occasionally whispering to ourselves about what we were supposed to do and whatever. Finally, just as the thing got close enough to where we should have seen the person behind the light, maybe 20 or 30 meters away, the light veered off the trail and into the brush in a way that it couldn't have done if it was a person with a flashlight. There was no slowing down or choppy steps or whatever. Then, just as it got to the point that it was obvious that there was no person there, the thing took off floating, maybe 10 or 15 feet into the air, still heading towards us, but now in the wood line instead of on the trail. When it got to about maybe 10 feet away from us, it literally just fizzled out with a little light trail and disappeared. We all looked at each other like, what the fuck was that? And we spent the next 10 minutes of our shift in silence before we went back to the tents. Yeah, and by the way, no drill sergeants came through that night at all. Something on the Plain by Sassy Owl. I was stationed in Little Rock in the mid-90s. Our primary mission was C-130 training support. I was a flight line guy and often required to climb into the C-130s when no one else was on the plane. Not a big deal. After a year on station, I got moved to overnight shift, 2230 to 0630. My primary job was to go to all the airframes scheduled to fly that day and upload water and such for the crew, and conduct other small tasks on the plane. Any given night, I would visit 25 or 30 individual planes. Little Rock Air Force Base is not the busiest airfield, nor did it receive regular military arrivals, so the place is dead after 1700 hours, leaving only cops, maintainers, and ATOC guys moving around for the most part. My job required all aircraft to be serviced prior to 0630, so you're out there in the dark driving plane to plane looking for tail numbers. I was on the flight line knocking out my list and drove up to the next plane just like any other. I parked in front of it and just felt creeped out. The planes, nearly 100 of them, were parked in a grid pattern, and some could be really far from the active area of the flight line. This particular plane was a couple hundred yards from the road, so once I turned my truck off, it was dark and silent, and I was surrounded by these giant black forms looming all around me. I sat in the truck for a few moments and looked around from the seat before I came to my senses and realized I was just in my own head. I got out and opened the tailgate, but then again I felt this horrible chill, and the breeze picked up. It was fall, but now I was cold, and that creeped out feeling returned. I finally went up the stairs, entering this unpowered plane with just my little mag light to see. I was counting the tie-downs on the plane near the middle of the cargo area, and I heard the distinct sound of someone else stepping on the stairs on the aircraft to enter it. That sound had two parts: the sound of the boot stepping down on the stairs, and then the sound of stairs touching down on the concrete. I spun around and dropped my light and tried to get quiet. The next two footsteps that would carry the visitor into the plane never came, and I stood frozen for a few minutes before just laughing it off. I grabbed my light and turned back to the tie-down, and just as I resumed, I clearly heard a male voice directly behind me ask, "Got a pen?" I spun around again. I'm pretty sure I screamed. It scared the shit out of me. The sound of the voice sounded like someone was standing directly behind me, but no one was there when I turned around. I froze for a moment, and then I bolted off the plane and tore off the flight line. It was about a mile drive back to my shop, and my heart was still pounding when I got back to the yard. All told, though, that was the only weird thing that happened to me at LRAFB. Humans Are Worse Than the Paranormal by MK15. I was on watch, unqualified, on a bridge with an OOD who didn't understand the radar. For those of you who don't know, the radar settings on a vessel need to be updated continuously with changing weather conditions. And this OOD trusted what the radar said at all times, no matter what, and refused to let anyone touch it or change the settings. We started the watch during a training exercise with some South American navies. Clear skies, great visibility. But suddenly clouds rolled in and the sun went away. Okay, that was fine. The radar was still giving us a good picture. Cue a massive rainstorm. I couldn't even see the bow of our ship. Safety course is 090. All ships went to 090. The problem was, the radar hadn't been returned for the rain, so the picture we were getting was now bullshit. I tried getting the radar back up to speed, but couldn't figure it out in a timely manner. I mean, I was the unqualified watchstander after all. Everyone froze as the ships were turning to 90, but they were still on 075. The captain was on the bridge and ordered that we come left for a ship that appeared to be going in front of us at a course of 075. I asked the captain to reconsider, as it was a decision made with faulty radar information, and he said no, come to 000. Cue the clusterfuck of about 8 Navy ships going in each different direction, within 1,000 yards or so of each other. We nearly had a few close calls. One ship passed astern of us with maybe 50 yards of clearance. I was pissed about that watch, visibly shaking afterwards from the thought that I was serving with imbeciles who didn't care to understand the radar, while also relying on it to make shit decisions. Hey guys, that's how you get Fitzgeralds and McCains. Thankfully, nothing happened in that very, very scary and very bad situation. Dogman on My Deployment by T.C. Cryptid. It was during my third deployment to Iraq. Our platoon had taken up residence in 2 houses in a village several miles south of Haditha. One day, I heard our translator having a heated discussion with 2 local men. So I grabbed my gear and my rifle and walked out to the road to investigate. I asked the translator what was going on, and he told me that these 2 men were crazy, but then he assured me that they weren't dangerous. I asked him what they wanted, and he mumbled something about them being superstitious or something along those lines. He assured me again that everything was okay and that my attention in the matter wasn't needed. It took a bit of prying, and I wasn't going anywhere, and the translator finally said that the 2 guys were having a wolfman problem, but they were afraid that if they shot at it, the local troops would be alarmed and attack their house. They told him that the wolfman had been coming around late at night and had already killed a few sheep, and they were worried that this thing was going to start attacking their family. So I assumed somewhere in translation the word dog had turned into wolf, and was somehow being conveyed to me by the translator as wolfman. So, trying to clarify, I said, "Did they mean a dog?" The translator was a bit hesitant, almost like he was embarrassed that his countrymen were wasting everyone's time by believing in such nonsense. But no, they were adamant that their house was being besieged by a wolfman. Again, I asked if it was just a big dog. The answer was no, it's a wolfman. So I asked the translator if there were wolves in Iraq, and all 3 of them were in agreement that yes, there are wolves in Iraq. But there are no wolves in that part of the country, and it's not a wolf or a large dog that's been killing their sheep. They insisted it was a wolfman. Finally, the translator was trying to usher them away, but by that point I was very intrigued, and still a bit confused over the whole dog-wolf-wolfman thing. So I asked them to describe exactly what they saw. They told me that every few nights this thing came around. They first saw it on 4 legs as it skulked around their small compound, but then it stood up like a man and walked on 2 legs. They said it growled and it had lunged at the men, but in their retreat, it had decided to turn its attention to their sheep. They also mentioned that their own dogs refused to help protect humans or sheep, and this thing just did its thing. They told me that the creature had killed a few of their sheep, and that they'd even found one of the bodies ripped apart with portions of it eaten away. They'd been hesitant to shoot at it for fear of troop involvement, and the translator said that he had heard of such a creature, and even though that type of story had been spread throughout the area by various people, it was no more than superstitions and delusions. He assured me that there was no such thing as a wolfman. I told the 2 men that they should feel free to protect themselves and their livestock, and with my interest piqued, I got the men to agree to allow us to stop by from time to time and set up an observation post while we were out on patrol. A couple of nights later, I joined a night patrol and we headed towards the house. We were greeted by one of the men and he gave us entry to the compound. We went up onto the roof and set out sentries to overlook a nearby bridge, and about an hour later the homeowner came up with a panicked look on his face. He was talking really fast, excitement and concern in his voice and body language. He wanted me to come with him, so I told 2 others, "Come with me," and we all followed the man. He led us to the other side of the house, and we exited onto an enclosed courtyard where the sheep were being kept. The sheep were making plenty of noise, and the man was pointing to a dark corner of the yard. I strained my eyes to see what he was pointing at. And finally, I saw it. A large wolf/dog just standing in the corner. I asked the other 2 guys with me if they saw it too, and they both agreed that it was a wolf or a dog. It moved behind a small section of wall, and I could hear popping and cracking noises, like joints or knuckles being cracked. When it stepped out from behind the wall, it was upright on 2 legs. It swiftly and effortlessly jumped the perimeter wall, and we could all hear it running away on 2 feet. I conveyed to the man as best I could that if that thing ever showed up again, feel free to shoot it if he could, and if he did, to please let me know. But I never heard back from him. Sexton Hall by Anonymous. The only time in my entire life I ever believed in anything like ghosts was at boot camp, although I could blame it on the lack of sleep. But in this instance, I had a witness. As a side note, not pertaining to the story, I arrived to boot camp on October 31st of 2006. We were later in training, and that's when we had to do watch at Sexton Hall. And I drew one of those watches in the middle of the night that sucks. So, me and another guy walked over to Sexton Hall with our flashlights. We were in training between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and at that time they had no classes from the week before Thanksgiving to the week after Christmas. And this is the first scary part of my story. Reverting would have sucked. We only had 32 people in my company, and the CCs really did everything not to revert people because it was like a 5-week revert. Anyway, so no one was at Sexton Hall is my point. We walked the halls and went to the second floor and shone our lights into the bunk room, and there was obviously nothing or no one there. But that's when we heard laughing in the other bunk room, and walked into the doorway and flashed our lights into it. 2 kids in pajamas, like 1950s PJs, ran through the light crossing what would have been the CC aisle. Both of us saw it. We called out, "Hello?" but there was no response, and we heard the laughing a little farther away, so we flicked on the lights, and there was nothing there. We walked around everywhere and never saw a thing. So we turned the lights out and walked back down the stairs and heard the laughing again. We'd had enough, but we thought it was a prank or a test, but we put everything in our log. The CCs called us out the next day, but no one said anything else about it until in week 8, when we were informed that we were not the first to report those 2 kids. Yeah, that's something I'll never forget. "8604" by Ninja Cat. I'm a crew chief, and I was supposed to catch 8604. Due to a well-earned game of rock, paper, scissors, I was able to go home early on weekend duty. Cut to me J-chilling, and I got a text. 8604 had arrived. The senior airman, SRA, that was taking care of the propulsion requirement systems was doing a combo and found a dead body. 8604 came back from Africa, and someone had snuck on board. In the main landing gear, there's a shelf where magic happens that lets the tires go up and down. This individual crawled up in there, and then flew in the plane for about 8 hours. That part of the plane is unpressurized, and there's no temperature control. If you've ever flown commercially, think of the exact opposite experience you had. Unfortunately, this guy did not survive. And mind you, this was also during the Ebola scare, and as I've mentioned, this flight came from Africa. Panic ensued. Paperwork was done, panels were removed and inspected, the SRA was quarantined, and security forces were forced. They couldn't remove the body until the whole investigation had been completed, and after everything was said and done, the plane finally got released back out to flying. I was on mid-shift at the time. Going on that plane at 0300 just to do fire extinguisher checks was creepy as fuck. or something simple as checking if the ramp had enough oil cans before it embarked on its next adventure. There was always this weird, creepy feeling, noises that there was something just behind you. One time, I was by myself and I swear that something dropped an object up on the flight deck, but I knew no one was there. There was a staff sergeant that got a blessed rosary from a church that he went to, and he hung it on the 244-245 station. Quality assurance made him remove it because of a foreign object debris complaint from a technical sergeant. The SRA got a permanent change of station to Yokota, and ultimately there, decided to end his life prematurely. I'm not sure exactly what had happened, but the TS that allegedly had been bullying him about the rosary got out on a retirement with no scraps, but the damage had been done to this senior airman. That whole situation still affects me on a daily basis. I'm now a suicide prevention instructor. But anyway, the plane eventually moved to Yokota after the SRA incident, and I've lost track as to anything else that happened to it as my career has been a roller coaster. But all that weird stuff that surrounded that flight will make me never forget 8604. Shadow Person on Board by Cicada's Wing. I served in the Coast Guard, and let's be real, some of our boats were old. Some of our stations were old. Lighthouses were constantly settings in fiction as the perfect spot for a horror story. When I was a non-raid on a 210 a few years ago, we were out doing a patrol out in the Caribbean, because of course we were. This was my third patrol on the same boat, so I had a decent idea of what to expect while underway. It was probably about a month into the patrol where I had the midwatch on helm and lookout. I vaguely remember the off-going lookout saying to me that he thought someone was on the flying bridge with him in the last hour, and he had that feeling once or twice, but no one from the bridge ever left there. But what I specifically do remember is that it was overcast and no stars were visible, which honestly was a bummer. My first hour went by on the helm and then to lookout. All quiet on lookout, super dark but nothing out of the ordinary. Helm, then my last hour on lookout. My eyes adjusted and I could see well enough to move freely, and it was about halfway through my time that I thought I heard the chains of the stanchions to the left of me move a bit, like someone had been leaning against them. I didn't think much of it until I put that little night vision scope they gave us up to my eye. I felt like someone was standing directly to my left. Easily, within inches of my shoulder, was a 7-foot shadow person. I know how it sounds. Overcast, super dark, eyes playing tricks on me, lack of sleep, could have been the split-second shadow of the mast made by the moon peeking out from the clouds, etc., etc., etc. But nah, that shit was humanoid, and it was a darker dark. It was dense. I couldn't see through it to the railing, which means it couldn't have been a shadow made by the mast, as I would have been able to see the railings, right? Naturally, I was shook as fuck, but the next day I asked the guy who was on duty before me what he saw, without telling him anything relating to my experience. His story matched mine almost exactly. A 7-footish dark black shadow person or whatever. Our GM1 told us that it was the Jumbie, which I didn't know was a real belief. So from then on we would fuck with each other saying the Jumbie was going to come and kill us, so we'd be non-rates forever on that boat. My service was good times, but I hope to never go back on that boat again. Army Ghost Story by Carver Boy. Here's my one and only ghost story. I was a young soldier at my first duty station. We had been moved from Turner Barracks in West Berlin to Andrews Barracks across town while they remodeled Turner. It was summer in Berlin on a Sunday night. I was sitting in the barred window of a basement laundry just up the street from the barracks. Pretty much all ground-level windows were barred on Andrews, so at the time I thought nothing of it. The laundry was near the end of a low corridor with overhead plumbing that you had to hit a timer switch to light. In the laundry, aside from washers and dryers, there were only 2 items of note: a Kiss pinball machine and an old jukebox. As I sat in the window reading a book, I had the place to myself. It was late, and Sunday night was my go-to night for laundry for that very reason. But suddenly, I heard a noise. A metal click and a whirl. It was coming from the jukebox. Since I was the only one there, my first thought was, I'm being pranked. So I hopped off the windowsill and darted to the hall, slapping the light timer. The hall was empty. I glanced down at my Timex as the needle dropped onto a record. It was midnight on the dot, and music began to blare from the jukebox. I broke out into a cold sweat suddenly, and I felt it trickle down my back. Living easy. I sprang into action, wrenching the dryer open and slamming damp BDUs into my laundry bag when I heard that. Lovin' free. I wanted so badly to be anywhere else. Season ticket on a one-way ride. I knew damn well where that song was leading, and I had no intention of being in the laundry room when the chorus hit. Yeah, if you haven't figured it out, Highway to Hell by AC/DC. I beat a hasty retreat back to the barracks and had a fitful night of sleep. The next day, I said nothing to anyone until after final formation. I saw an older SSG on CQ. He was drinking coffee that was most likely spiked with Baileys, and he was on his second 3-year hitch in Berlin, and not in my platoon. In short, he was the perfect person to ask about any ghostly events. So I walked over to him and opened with, "Have you ever heard of anything happening here at Andrews, Staff Sergeant?" He immediately broke into a grin. "Well, for starters, talk to anyone over in HQ barracks and they'll tell you about the late-night phantoms marching in the halls." He proceeded to tell me about people whipping doors open late at night to tell whoever was doing the D&C in the hall to cut it out, only to find an empty hall with only one central stairwell. So, encouraged by the fact that maybe my story wasn't so ridiculous, I broached the topic of the laundry. "Ever hear anything in particular about the basement laundry?" I asked. He looked at me and said, "As a matter of fact, yes." I could tell by the way he rocked back in his chair and grinned at me that I was not going to be reassured by what he was going to say next. He went on. The laundry was a cell where Hitler tortured his political rivals to death on the night of the Long Knives. I blinked a couple of times, then thanked him for the history lesson, and right then and there decided that late-night laundry was no longer going to be an option for me. Army Ghost Story by Carver Boy. Here's my one and only ghost story. I was a young soldier at my first duty station. We had been moved from Turner Barracks in West Berlin to Andrews Barracks across town while they remodeled Turner. It was summer in Berlin on a Sunday night. I was sitting in the barred window of a basement laundry just up the street from the barracks. Pretty much all ground-level windows were barred on Andrews, so at the time I thought nothing of it. The laundry was near the end of a low corridor with overhead plumbing that you had to hit a timer switch to light. In the laundry, aside from washers and dryers, there were only 2 items of note: a Kiss pinball machine and an old jukebox. As I sat in the window reading a book, I had the place to myself. It was late, and Sunday night was my go-to night for laundry for that very reason. But suddenly, I heard a noise. A metal click and a whirl. It was coming from the jukebox. Since I was the only one there, my first thought was, I'm being pranked. So I hopped off the windowsill and darted to the hall, slapping the light timer. The hall was empty. I glanced down at my Timex as the needle dropped onto a record. It was midnight on the dot, and music began to blare from the jukebox. I broke out into a cold sweat suddenly, and I felt it trickle down my back. Living easy. I sprang into action, wrenching the dryer open and slamming damp BDUs into my laundry bag when I heard that. Lovin' free. I wanted so badly to be anywhere else. Season ticket on a one-way ride. I knew damn well where that song was leading, and I had no intention of being in the laundry room when the chorus hit. Yeah, if you haven't figured it out, Highway to Hell by AC/DC. I beat a hasty retreat back to the barracks and had a fitful night of sleep. The next day, I said nothing to anyone until after final formation. I saw an older SSG on CQ. He was drinking coffee that was most likely spiked with Baileys, and he was on his second 3-year hitch in Berlin, and not in my platoon. In short, he was the perfect person to ask about any ghostly events. So I walked over to him and opened with, "Have you ever heard of anything happening here at Andrews, Staff Sergeant?" He immediately broke into a grin. "Well, for starters, talk to anyone over in HQ barracks and they'll tell you about the late-night phantoms marching in the halls." He proceeded to tell me about people whipping doors open late at night to tell whoever was doing the D&C in the hall to cut it out, only to find an empty hall with only one central stairwell. So, encouraged by the fact that maybe my story wasn't so ridiculous, I broached the topic of the laundry. "Ever hear anything in particular about the basement laundry?" I asked. He looked at me and said, "As a matter of fact, yes." I could tell by the way he rocked back in his chair and grinned at me that I was not going to be reassured by what he was going to say next. He went on. The laundry was a cell where Hitler tortured his political rivals to death on the night of the Long Knives. I blinked a couple of times, then thanked him for the history lesson, and right then and there decided that late-night laundry was no longer going to be an option for me.